Hello and welcome to I Know Dino. I'm Garrett.
And I'm Sabrina.
And today in our 478th episode, we have lots of Tyrannosaur news, everybody's favorite. Maybe not everybody, but a lot of people's. We have Nanotyrannus, the debate continuing, a new paper saying that it is in fact its own genus and not just a synonym of T-Rex.
Dun dun dun.
We're going to get into all of the details about the response to the paper, as well as what the paper is saying about Nanotyrannus.
Plus, there's a new debate about the evolution of another ferocious tyrannosaur, Daspletosaurus. And just quickly, if you heard the end of our episode from last week, we have a little bit of a mix-up. We will get to the new dinosaurs in next week's episode, and it'll be very fitting because we're interviewing Carrie Woodruff, which is another hint as to the type of dinosaurs we'll be covering.
Oh, is it sauropods?
You got it.
Second try. So more carnivores this week, more tyrannosaurs.
Mm-hmm.
I saw somebody describe 2024 as the year of the tyrannosaur already.
Wow, already.
Which it certainly has been so far. We'll see how long it keeps up. It's got good potential with the dueling dinosaurs.
Oh yeah, that's this year.
Well, I mean, it could be this year. They're working on it currently. But in this episode, we also have Dinosaur of the Day, Bistahieversor, and I've got a fun fact, which is even more about tyrannosaurs, and a baby Tyrannosaurus, potentially, that most people don't know about it. I didn't know about it until I was digging into Nanotyrannus.
Oh, I like hearing about the babies.
Mm-hmm. But before we get into all of that, as always, we like to thank some of our patrons for helping to keep our podcast running. Again, 2 weeks in a row, we have 10 new patrons to thank.
Amazing.
So this week, our new patrons are Kumakani, Thunderlock, Tara, David, Jeffrey, Ellie, Claire, Mango Fox, Fergus, and Dennis.
That's so cool. Thank you so much to all of our new patrons and, of course, all of our existing patrons. Our community is really what keeps us going.
Absolutely, yes. I check the Discord almost every time I'm about to work on our podcast because it really revs me up and gets me excited about dinosaurs and research and all that stuff. So thank you all. Jumping into the news, we got to kick it off with the Nanotyrannus paper.
Just gotta.
Gotta. Is what people want to know.
So what did you learn? I know you did a very deep dive into this. A very deep Eutyrannosaurus burrow, one might say.
Yes. So I read the new paper, which is quite long, and also many, many informal responses to the paper. I also went back and revisited the original Nanotyrannus description, some other stuff, because it felt necessary.
It's relevant.
Yeah. There's a quick Nanotyrannus background in case you don't know the story. I didn't know the story. Every time I read about Nanotyrannus, I learn something new about it. It's a pretty long story. So it basically goes back to 1942. Is a specific skull that was found. It's called CMNH 7541. It's often just called the Cleveland specimen. And in 1946, Charles Gilmore named it Gorgosaurus lancensis as a new species of Gorgosaurus because looking at it, it looks a lot like Gorgosaurus. Gorgosaurus is a close relative of Tyrannosaurus, so it's not too surprising that they would all be in the same conversation. But in 1988, Bob Bacher, Phil Curry, and Michael Williams renamed it Nanotyrannus, and that's partly because they discovered that Gorgosaurus lancensis, as it was called at the time, was millions of years more recent than the Gorgosaurus type species. So oftentimes, if there's a really big difference in time, you don't put them in the same genus name because they're just likely to be pretty different animals.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense.
They also found quite a few details different in the skull, so they figured it's not that close to Gorgosaurus, so we should split it out. That paper itself is really great. It has tons of beautiful images between the late Cretaceous large predator skulls, so you can really nicely compare them together. It's available for free online. I think it's worth at least paging through. It's on a issue where the cover is a big Nanotyrannus attacking something, and there's one of those nice drawn to scale pictures. So there's a T-Rex in the background and a Nanotyrannus in front of that. And then there's like a human and I think maybe a small like Psittacosaurus or something
So
in the
you can
mix
see the
too.
differences in sizes.
Yeah, it's a really nice paper. I enjoy it, even if some of the details in it aren't considered the most up to date. But in that paper, that's what they named Nanotyrannus, meaning dwarf tyrant, because it looks like other tyrannosaurs, but it's smaller. And they estimated it very roughly to be about 17 feet or 5 meters long. But that's based on just a skull, which is pretty hard to get the estimate for a body from a skull. In 1999, so jumping forward another 11 years, Thomas Carr published a comparison considering Nanotyrannus to be a juvenile T-Rex. At this point, the Cleveland specimen had been dated to the same time period as T-Rex, and he noted that it had key similarities in the skull with T-Rex that other tyrannosaurs don't have, and at that point, we had already found other Tyrannosaur growth series, like Tarbosaurus, for example. So he sort of applied that logic to this Nanotyrannus into T-Rex. To be fair, though, there are a ton of differences between a Nanotyrannus or juvenile T-Rex and an adult T-Rex. The head is a pretty drastically different shape. It's much shorter top to bottom. It has a much pointier snout. It doesn't have that huge bone-crushing head or even the proportions of it shrunk down that we're used to seeing with T-Rex as like a longer, more narrow snout in appearance. It also has more teeth in its jaws. And basically all of the openings in the skull are different sizes and shapes than an adult T-Rex.
The bodies were different too. They filled a totally different niche in their habitats.
Yeah. And that's true for juvenile tyrannosaurs seen elsewhere too. So you could see how people would argue that it's too different to be considered the same genus, or how people might say, well, it's just young and it hasn't grown into its full bulk yet. It's just sort of a lanky, awkward teenager at this point. In 2001, another small tyrannosaurid specimen, nicknamed Jane, was found and was quickly recognized by most people to be the same species as the Cleveland specimen. Regardless of what it is, they figured it's probably the same as the Cleveland specimen. Jane is much more complete, including a lot of the skeleton, and technically Jane might be a different species since the holotype is only the Cleveland specimen, but again, most people consider them to be the same. If we assume they're the same species, the body of Nanotyrannus is much thinner or more gracile, like you were just saying. The limbs are longer. The arms don't even have that weirdly small look that you would expect to see on a T-Rex. They look much more proportional than an adult T-Rex. And they have larger claws, and not just larger proportionally. One specimen even has a larger hand claw than Sue.
Wow.
So that, to me, is one of the strangest things about Nanotyrannus, and maybe one of the best pieces of evidence about it being its own species. It's very strange that an adult would have smaller claws on an absolute scale, let alone a proportional scale, than a juvenile. Although we have seen in the past things like horn cores that shrink over time, because this isn't necessarily the size of the actual claw, it's just the inner part of the claw with the sheath going over it, so it's potentially something that could change. Since Jane is housed at the Burpee Museum, and there was a lot of interest in this, in 2005 there was a conference on tyrannosaurs at the Burpee, and based on the new Jane material, most people were convinced after the conference that Nanotyrannus is most likely a juvenile T-Rex. Again, that's because there are a lot of comparisons of Jane to juvenile tyrannosaurs seen elsewhere, and combining that with the Cleveland specimen holotype, it seemed like, okay, it all sort of fits together as it being a juvenile, a lot of juvenile characteristics. And for most paleo nerds, I think this is the point at which afterwards, if you said Nanotyrannus, people treated you like you were saying Brontosaurus.
Oh.
Basically, being ridiculed and getting like that. Actually, Nanotyrannus is a juvenile T-Rex. But I think that's pretty unfair. Just like with Brontosaurus, where there's still a debate about whether or not it is its own genus. The same is true about Nanotyrannus. I think there's a very valid debate still going on. I think sometimes we get caught up in this too and tend to say Nanotyrannus isn't a thing. It's a juvenile T-Rex. You're saying I do it?
Yeah.
Yeah. I usually try to say Nanotyrannus / juvenile T-Rex, but sometimes I might just say juvenile T-Rex. In 2018, Holly Woodward and others reported on histology in Jane and Petey. Petey's another specimen, not nearly as good as Jane, but it does have some fossils from the body, not just the skull, so they can be cut into to see the age.
I remember that. We heard that talk at SVP.
Yeah. Yeah, 2018 is the SVP date. I think it actually was published in like 2020, but it was basically published in 2018 when they showed it off.
I guess.
I mean, it was shared and put into the public record. In that presentation, they estimated that Jane was about 13 years old and Petey was between 14 and 18 years old. They concluded that Nanotyrannus is a juvenile T-Rex and not its own genus. Again, sort of repeating the last couple findings from Carr and also in 2005. Although there was one kind of strange thing, and that's that Petey's legs were relatively close together, possibly showing its growth slowing, but they noted that growth can be really inconsistent in dinosaurs, so they weren't convinced that it was on its way to full size, and therefore they concluded that Jane and Petey were still juvenile T-Rexes, and that Nanotyrannus is just a synonym of T-Rex.
Mm-hmm.
Sabrina actually made a YouTube video about this at the time that you may have seen.
Oh, yeah. Sort of forgot about that.
I rewatched it to refresh.
Does it hold up?
Yeah, it's good.
Oh, thanks.
In 2020, Thomas Carr did a very thorough analysis of Tyrannosaurus growth and found that Nanotyrannus was a juvenile T-Rex. Basically, it fit on his expected plot, the S-curve of growth. And again, he didn't see an EFS in any of the specimens until the age of 22 years old. So everything under 22 was still basically a juvenile or a subadult because we didn't get that close together growth rings showing that it was really barely growing anymore until one of the 22-year-olds. That was the youngest one that had it. So again, not too surprising that Petey didn't have it when Petey could be as young as 14.
Petey was still very much growing.
It seems that way. Interestingly, while doing this, I discovered you can't even look up Nanotyrannus on the PaleoBio database.
Oh.
Because it just auto-corrects it to Tyrannosaurus rex. Because I wanted to see, like, where are all the Nanotyrannus specimens? But it's controversial enough that it just shows you Tyrannosaurus. Okay, now that we've got the background, what does the new paper say? Well, the paper is by Nicholas Longrich and Evan Seda. It was published in Fossil Studies, a journal I don't think we've covered before, but the article is open access, so anyone can read it, which is great.
Nice.
Except it's extremely long and pretty dense. But you can go there and look at the pictures. Might be worth doing. They came up with 6 pieces of evidence for why Nanotyrannus should be its own genus. So they're in team Nanotyrannus should be split out from juvenile T-Rex.
Splitters, okay.
Yep. Their first piece of evidence is that there are a lot of predatory dinosaurs and often more than one tyrannosaur in an ecosystem, so there should be more than one species in Hell Creek with T-Rex. It's kind of a strange one. Number 2, Nanotyrannus has lots of differences from T-Rex. Number 3, histology shows that Nanotyrannus growth was slowing, giving an approximately 1.5 ton adult, which is much smaller than an adult T-Rex. Number 4, the differences between Nanotyrannus and T-Rex are more dramatic than the juvenile Gorgosaurus to adult Gorgosaurus and juvenile Tarbosaurus to adult Tarbosaurus changes. So those are the other Tyrannosaurs where we can look at the juveniles and see how they changed.
And even though they changed a lot, it wasn't as much compared to these two.
That's what they're saying, yeah. Number 5 is that there are juvenile T-Rex specimens already, which refute Nanotyrannus being a juvenile T-Rex.
Intrigue.
Yes. And number 6 is that phylogenetics show that Nanotyrannus is a basal, distant relative of T-Rex, possibly not even a tyrannosaurid.
Oh. Well, that's different.
Yes. So I figured I would just give their whole suite of arguments up front, and then we can go through them and sort of say what other people are saying about them or why they might hold up or why they might not hold up. And I should say too, The article itself isn't just purely Nanotyrannus is its own genus. It's pretty balanced. They talk quite a bit about the shortcomings of how you can't really definitively prove that Nanotyrannus is its own genus or that Nanotyrannus should be a juvenile T-Rex because we just have too many error bars. There's just not enough information to be definitive about it. But they're basically saying they think that the preponderance of evidence, most of the information we have, shows that Nanotyrannus should be its own genus. So now the burden of proof should be on showing it isn't rather than the other way around. So for their first point, saying that we should expect more medium to large predators, they actually say in the paper, quote, patterns of diversity in Tyrannosauridae and other predators, the frequent coexistence of two species of tyrannosaurs suggests that this pattern is the rule, end quote.
Oh, interesting.
Which a lot of people lashed onto it being a rule and said, what are you talking about? There's no rule that says there need to be multiple species of tyrannosaurs in an ecosystem.
There's no rules in dinosaur world.
There's no rules in nature, that's for sure. It's all crazy all the time.
But then you have things like Bergman's rule.
Which, isn't really a rule either. And there are also people who have said, well, the reason that there aren't multiple tyrannosaur species is because T-Rex was unusual and took longer to grow, kind of thing. So the young Tyrannosaurus rex was filling a different niche than the adult Tyrannosaurus rex. Although you could easily see how someone would say, well, why not have a separate species fill that other niche?
Yeah.
It does seem like most people agree with the idea that there are probably multiple species of T-Rex, but the question is really how we can tell which ones are which from just the bones, and then how we even would classify them, like we've been talking about with T. regina, T. imperator, and then T. mex, or T. macraensis more recently. But Nanotyrannus could definitely be in the mix. So the second point that Nanotyrannus has lots of differences from T-Rex. This was previously discussed by Carr's 2020 paper, and no one really disputes that there are hundreds, if not thousands, of differences if you look at every little subtle change in the bones. But really, it's closely connected to their other point, which I had as point number 4, that the difference between Nanotyrannus and T-Rex are more dramatic than the juvenile Gorgosaurus to adult Gorgosaurus and juvenile Tarbosaurus to adult Tarbosaurus changes. And this is just a big ol' lumper versus splitter question, which they actually talk about lumping versus splitting and how it seems to be kind of cyclical. Like during the Bone Wars, it was all splitting, naming as much stuff as possible. And then afterwards, people were really conservative and lumped a ton of stuff together, maybe because they were frustrated with how much stuff got split during the Bone Wars.
Maybe, but then you ended up with a lot of wastebasket taxons.
Yeah, exactly. So too much lumping or too much splitting is bad, and you do need the balance. So it's good that there are papers coming out on both sides of it to get us to figure out what the most likely answer is on all these issues. I thought it was kind of fun too. They pointed out a specific scientist they said, yeah, this guy was a lumper and even he considered Nanotyrannus to be valid. As if that meant something important. I don't know about that logic, but I enjoyed that. But the question here is really how many changes are needed to demonstrate a juvenile specimen is different, meaning a different species, than an adult specimen. And that answer just varies depending on who you ask. If it's a lumper, the answer is you need tons and tons of differences, and they need to be something that can never be explained by ontogeny or by how it changed as it grew up. And if you ask a splitter, the answer might be, well, you need 10 or something. So for that reason, we like to compare adult species as much as possible, and usually holotypes are picked from adults when possible because animals can change so much as they grow up. Unfortunately, again, we don't have a Nanotyrannus with an EFS, meaning we don't have an adult definitive Nanotyrannus. So it's really up for debate how different they need to be. And the only way to really settle this is to find a Nanotyrannus with an EFS, because if you found a truly unequivocal adult Nanotyrannus, there's no more arguing that it's a juvenile T-Rex. That's the one way you could completely close off the argument.
It's just like the Torosaurus Triceratops debate.
It is. Yeah, it's very similar. They mentioned that in the paper too. And that's also interesting because the consensus there seems to be more on the lumping side
Mm-hmm.
as well as it is with this Tyrannosaurus.
Oh, we must be in a lumping time.
Yeah. Another way we might be able to settle the debate is if we found a juvenile T-Rex that's smaller than all the Nanotyrannus that we have, but with more adult features, because then you would say, okay, even this little tiny T-Rex looks more like an adult than Nanotyrannus does. So it obviously, by the time it was the size of Nanotyrannus, would have also looked more like an adult T-Rex. But that's a little bit fuzzier than the finding a Nanotyrannus, which is a clear adult. They also made the point about phylogenetics showing that Nanotyrannus is a basal distant relative of T-Rex, possibly not even a Tyrannosaurid, like a more distant Tyrannosauroid.
Yeah, that seems like a big claim.
It is, and a lot of people took issues with that point because there is an expression ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, which is a really jargony way to say that oftentimes young individuals look like their ancestors. And by ancestors, I mean distant species, not just parents.
Mm-hmm.
Usually the phrase refers to embryos. For example, if you look at a human embryo, it starts out looking a lot like a fish. We've got eyes on the sides of our heads. We even have a tail. We don't look anything like even a baby human in the beginning phases of an embryo. But then over time, things change pretty dramatically. Recent phylogenetics have shown that that doesn't just apply to embryos, but also applies to animals as they grow up after they're born or hatched. And in the case of tyrannosaurs, if you take a juvenile and you categorize it separately from the adult, they tend to show up with the ancestors farther up the family tree because of that ontogeny recapitulating phylogeny partially. So the original Nanotyrannus paper, actually, interestingly, doesn't show Nanotyrannus as particularly close as a relative to T-Rex. It's just like they describe it here, where it's a more basal tyrannosaur off kind of on its own. So they're right that if it's its unique genus, it won't be that close of a relative to T-Rex, most likely. And they did acknowledge in the paper, too, that this issue exists. They tried to control for it by basically, when they scored Nanotyrannus for their phylogenetic assessment, they tried to take out all the characters that are linked to changing over time. But the problem with that is you don't really know if it would change or not. So they're saying, we don't think these characteristics would change in Tyrannosaurus, so we're going to leave them in. But other people say, yeah, they do change. So it's another one of those. You can't really know until you find an adult. Another key point that they made is that the histology shows that Nanotyrannus growth was slowing and giving that 1.5 ton adult estimate. To get that estimate, they used existing data from Woodward in 2018, as well as a couple other sources, but they reached a different conclusion than those authors did. So they basically disagree that PD would have grown much more and said that the growth appears to be tapering off rather than getting ready for an S-curve increase.
Oh, okay.
So obviously, Woodward et al. Said that basically this could just be explained by variability. So it had a couple slow growth years, but that doesn't mean anything. There's a ton of variability. And when you look at the lags, they are all over the place. So they have a point. They both have a point. If PD happened to have a couple years where it was growing a little slower, it could be a juvenile T-Rex. If it's the start of a trend, then it's probably not a juvenile T-Rex. It's probably a much smaller species. I will say, though, many paleontologists took issue with their histological interpretation of the bones. Basically, they counted the lags and used the lag count as their x-axis, meaning the x-axis, they're plotting how big the dinosaur was on estimate on the y-axis, and then the lag count on the x-axis. But what a lot of people are saying is they should have estimated the age for the x-axis rather than just count the lag. It's a subtle but important difference. It's because tyrannosaurs have hollow bones, and as they grow, the earlier lags disappear. So in order to get a good age estimate, you have to include an estimate of how many lags have gone missing for it to plot right. So basically, the way they plotted it, you've got this Tyrannosaurus that looks like it's growing really rapidly, and then you've got Nanotyrannus below it that looks like it's barely growing at all. But If you shifted the Nanotyrannus to the left because it has less lags that disappeared, then it might line up a lot more neatly.
Mm-hmm.
Then the last point that they made is that there are juvenile T-Rex specimens already, which refute Nanotyrannus being a juvenile T-Rex.
Dun dun dun.
I think that one is a little bit circular, and they're basically saying Nanotyrannus isn't juvenile Tyrannosaurus because this juvenile Tyrannosaurus isn't Nanotyrannus. But there are some new potential dinosaurs that might clear this up. So one newish potential Nanotyrannus is the Jordan Theropod, which was assigned to Obsilodon and later to Stygivenator molneri. If that turns out to be Nanotyrannus, some of the characters in it might help to support Nanotyrannus being its own genus. And they also have a table of a total of a dozen Nanotyrannus specimens that they consider to be Nanotyrannus.
Oh, wow.
Which is pretty cool. And it's a bigger list than I've seen elsewhere.
Mm-hmm. I only knew about Jane and Petey, really. Oh, and the Cleveland one.
Yes, and there's one at the LA Natural History Museum, and there's also one at the Museum of the Rockies. They have one from the Field Museum, the American Museum of Natural History, Royal Saskatchewan Museum, and then they also include the dueling dinosaurs in it.
Oh, but we don't know yet.
We don't. But yeah, those could all be contenders for helping to clear this up. And that table is something that Tom Holt said he really appreciated about this paper, was sort of laying out some of these potential Nanotyrannus specimens. Of course, like I said, there's been a fair amount of criticism of this paper. As always, Thomas Carr was good for a pithy quote. He told Live Science the study, quote, doesn't settle the question at all.
The debate is ongoing, just like with Taurosaurus and Triceratops.
Yes. Thomas Holtz and Dave Hone also didn't agree with the conclusions. And considering the three of them are three of the biggest names in Tyrannosaurus studies, their opinion does mean quite a bit in this matter.
Mm-hmm.
But I wouldn't characterize the study simply as wrong. A lot of people have been saying that online, that they disagree with it, or ad hominem attacks on the authors, which is just silly. You know, you can look at it for what's in the paper. And like I said, they actually do a pretty balanced approach. They talk about the issues with their analysis as much as I did here. I read all the criticisms before I read the paper, just so I was going in with a little bit more of a critical eye. And then I found that almost all the criticisms were already in the paper.
Oh, okay.
So they're well aware of the controversy and the fact that it's not a slam dunk case. Tom Holtz has a really fun Twitter thread on this, which started with something like, my colleagues won't let me get any other work done until I tell them about what I think about this paper. So I'm just going to spell it all out here. I did like a 20-part thread on all his thoughts on it. And he mentioned several things that the paper added to the debate. So again, adding those new fossils as potential Nanotyrannus specimens. You can see it in table 6 if you want to look it up. He also liked that they summarized some of the differences between reported Tyrannosaurus and Nanotyrannus specimens, and that there was a new interpretation of the histology that I was talking about. But again, that histology does seem to be a pretty big focal point of the study, and the variability in how they grow and the lack of an EFS just means that we really can't settle this without a new fossil.
That's often the case.
Yeah. So it's still the case. It's a good reminder, though, that this debate is far from settled, the Nanotyrannus versus juvenile T-Rex. I would still say that the most likely thing is still juvenile T-Rex. It's very weird that out of the 50 to 100 Tyrannosaurus specimens we don't have any real juveniles or very few juveniles. But we do have this smattering of Nanotyrannus that sort of fit in that size. But it's close. It's still close to 50-50, I would say.
I would just add, because you said that this debate is far from settled, a lot of paleontology debates are far from settled.
That's true. But this is one that we might actually be able to settle easily if we find one more fossil. That could be true for a lot of them, though, I suppose.
Yes.
If it's the right fossil, it can tell you a lot.
That's why we often say #need more fossils.
And now we're going to pause for a quick sponsor break. But when we get back, we're going to talk about another Tyrannosaur paper.
And maybe the beginnings of a debate. In other Tyrannosaur news, as promised, Daspletosaurus may not have evolved via anagenesis. This was published in Cretaceous research by Charlie Roger Scherer and Christian Voikula-Suholvad. And anagenesis, in very, very basic terms, one way of putting it is that it's one species evolving into another.
Yeah, like directly,
Mm-hmm.
without anything in between, and
Like that's a direct ancestor.
yes, which is really hard to prove.
Yes, and that's why it's a big deal, too, because it could answer a lot of questions if you knew that that was the case. So a quick recap on Daspletosaurus. There are 3 species of Daspletosaurus. There's Taurusus, Horneri, and Wilsoni, and as the authors of this paper put it, quote, proposed fourth known from the Dinosaur Park and Oldman formations. Daspletosaurus, again, is a tyrannosaurid, and tyrannosaurids are known for those large skulls and short arms with only 2 fingers on each hand.
They're also the biggest tyrannosaurs, the tyrannosaurids,
Mm-hmm.
like Tyrannosaurus.
Now, back in 2022, Elias Warshaw and Denver Fowler described Daspletosaurus wilsoni, the newest named species. We interviewed them about it back in episode 418, if you want to check that out. And they suggested anagenesis for Daspletosaurus when they described Daspletosaurus wilsoni. Now, 4 things have to be true to even hypothesize that anagenesis is what's happening. In technical terms, first, the taxa have a sister group relationship or are successive sister taxa. Second, taxa are stratigraphically sequential. Third, stratigraphic position doesn't conflict with phylogenetic position. And fourth, taxa share similar geographic ranges. To sum that up, and I'm just going to use the case of Daspletosaurus here, the animals must be closely related.
You could also say the closest related. There can't be anything in between them.
True. They have to be found in rock layers that are sequential in time so that they're not overlapping each other in time. And where they're found doesn't conflict with phylogeny, the relationships between groups of animals or organisms, and they have to be found in similar areas.
Yeah. So I guess in a perfect scenario, what you would have is you'd have one species of Daspletosaurus far down in the rock, and then directly above it, like 10 meters up higher in the rock, you'd have a different species of Daspletosaurus, so that you would say, okay, this one got buried, and then millions of years later, this next one got buried, or maybe just 1 million years later, this next one got buried in the exact same place, and we can tell that it was definitely later because it's directly above it, and then when we analyze it, you can see all these details that are the same, and a couple things that are different. So we're going to say it's a different species. That would be like the perfect version of anagenesis.
I don't think perfect versions happen in paleontology.
No. But sometimes you get it where one's buried, 10 meters deeper, and then 40 miles away, there's one that's buried 10 meters higher, and you can tell because the rock is like consistent enough and not too messed up in between that you can tell those are the height differences. But even that is very rare.
Well, so the authors of this newest paper are suggesting that there isn't anagenesis with Daspletosaurus because there's actually 3 of the species overlapped in time. They lived around the same time. One reason they say this is that where the holotype of Daspletosaurus wilsoni was found, they say that the assumptions used to date where it was found might be erroneous. Even in the paper describing wilsoni, Warshaw and Fowler said the location was, quote, sedimentologically atypical, end quote.
So it didn't have that nice even, like I was describing, layers where you can tell how high it is. One of them might have been a little mixed around.
Yeah. Well, also in the Wilsoni paper, there's proposed times for when each Daspletosaurus species lived. The proposal is that Taurusus was at 77 million years ago, Wilsoni was at 76.5 million years ago, and Horneri was at 75 million years ago. But the authors of this paper argued that there should be ranges of time considered. And they found overlapping stratigraphic ranges for Daspletosaurus taurusus and Daspletosaurus wilsoni based on some previous papers and descriptions of these Daspletosaurs, well, Taurusus and Horneri, where the range for Taurusus is about 78 to 75.3 million years, and Wilsoni living around 76.5 million years kind of fits into that range. There's also some overlapping ranges they found for Taurusus and the yet unnamed 4th species. which then would mean that 3 species lived around the same time. You've got Taurusus, wilsoni, and the unnamed 4th species.
So it sounds like if they could get those error bars down and get more specific about the timing of them, it could still be supported, maybe.
Maybe.
It is really hard to get good stratigraphic dating on fossils because sedimentary rocks don't have usually anything that you can do dating on. So in order to do like uranium lead dating is a really good one. You need these zircon crystals typically, which are formed by volcanism, and they don't leave sedimentary rock behind. So unless it got buried by volcanic ash that happened to have these crystals in it, which it does happen sometimes. Dinosaurs do occasionally get buried by volcanic ash, and sometimes there's preservation there. You could maybe date that specific fossil using that strategy. But in general, when it's just like a riverbed or something, you don't have it, and you have to find these dates at bookends around it. And that's where you get those big error bars, because you find one thing that's much deeper in the sediment and one that's way above it. And all you can say is that it was in between those dates.
Yeah.
And then there's also error bars on the dating itself, depending on how good of a sample you get.
Again, just no perfect scenarios in paleontology.
It's very squishy, which is why to most paleontologists, a million years is like the margin of error. To us, it's an extremely long time, but to a dinosaur, it's like 76, 77 million years ago, something like that. It's close enough. Except when you're trying to prove something like this.
Yeah. Well, the authors of this paper also approached their phylogenetic analysis a little bit differently from Warshaw and Fowler. They said they included a few additional diagnostic characters or unique traits. And based on that, they found that Daspletosaurus horneri was the most basal of the species, even though it's the youngest. It lived the most recently in time. And if that was the case, that wouldn't work with anagenesis.
That's true. By definition, things are more derived when they're evolved into.
But they do think anagenesis could be a main driver of evolution. However, they also suggested that Daspletosaurus wilsoni could be a junior synonym of Daspletosaurus taurusus. There's just not enough distinct characters, or as they put it, a quote, a near lack of, meaning not enough distinct characters.
Gotcha.
They also noted limitations on the fossil record and how we don't know when exactly a species first stepped onto the scene, because the fossil record can only tell us a minimum age for a species. So it could be that the holotype of Daspletosaurus wilsoni is from a point in time when the species was, quote, well established in the ecosystem. And if that's true, then maybe Daspletosaurus wilsoni evolved a bit earlier than the holotype shows us.
Yeah, but that's maybe a little bit of a harsh criticism, because it's saying, well, maybe there are even earlier ones, and maybe there's later ones of this, so maybe they overlap more, but maybe not, too.
Right. And a lot of times we go by what we definitely know.
That's really all you can do.
Hypothesize around that.
Yeah. It is a fair point, though. It's good to keep in mind that just because you find a fossil that looks like it's 76.5 million years ago, even if you have perfect dating on it, it doesn't mean that that species only lived 76.5 million years ago. It could have lived for a million years on either side of that.
Just need to find more fossils. Hashtag more fossils.
Yeah.
Which brings me to another limitation that they brought up is the low number of individuals found in the Daspletosaurus species. So one thing that may help clarify this is if and when that 4th unnamed species gets described, as well as descriptions of additional specimens of Daspletosaurus taurusus. So they kind of wrapped it up with, quote, due to the nature of the fossil record, it's unlikely that anagenesis will ever be supported unequivocally, end quote. So yes, anagenesis, very hard to prove, but I think it's always exciting to think about, and we'll see how this debate goes on.
Yeah, it's a lot more satisfying when it's this animal evolves into that, than just saying like they had a common ancestor and then they both evolved from that common ancestor. We don't know when or how or what that common ancestor exactly was, because that might not have fossilized. It's a nicer story if you have them all in a row.
So that's our big Tyrannosaur news. Although I just realized that the rest of our news items have to do with theropods.
Yep. Not to mention the dinosaur of the day and the fun fact.
Yep. Well, I'll start with the Children's Museum of Indianapolis has a new Allosaurus with skin impressions, belly ribs, and evidence of injuries.
Oh, cool.
It was found as part of Mission Jurassic. It's this years-long project where the museum leased land in the Bighorn Basin in Wyoming to dig for fossils, and it was found at the Jurassic Mile dig site. An excavator found it while expanding the quarry, and they ended up finding an articulated Allosaurus.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. It took them a while to get all of the parts of the Allosaurus. They got the legs back in 2020, the hips and tail in 2022, and the ribcage, neck, and skull in 2023. And then those have skin impressions.
That's so cool.
I know. There's some interesting things they found so far, like the femur or the thigh bone was healing. There's an infection in the tibia and fibula and the lower leg bones. And then there's just a lot of skin impressions from a few places on the body, on parts of the body that hadn't been found before.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah. And in one of the articles I read, they said the skin's leathery and it looks kind of like chicken feet scales.
Yeah. I remember too people talking about skin impressions and how they can be kind of weird because you don't know exactly if the animal was already dead for like a month before the skin impression or whatever. So it might not, even if it looks kind of leathery, it could have been leathery after being out in the sun for weeks.
Oh, that's a good point.
So it's hard with that, but the size and shape of the scales can be really interesting and useful to know about how things moved and all sorts of other details. So
yeah,
that'll be really cool to see when they publish it.
Well, so it's on display in the Paleolab now, and the team is preparing and studying it, and the legs are in a case in front of the lab. So it sounds like if you visit the museum, you can see them preparing it.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, articulated skeletons are always really cool. And when you add in some details like
skin impressions, some soft tissue stuff.
Yeah, that's great. It'd be really fun if they found like a feather impression or something.
Oh, man.
Maybe
they will. Yeah, I don't know.
Allosaurus is pretty old, so it doesn't fit the timeline of some of the other ones, but you never know.
You never know.
There are those theories or hypotheses, maybe I should say, that maybe the common ancestor of pterosaurs and dinosaurs had feathers or feather precursors. So it's definitely, it could happen for Allosaurus. You don't know.
Well, back to the Tyrannosaurs. Trinity the T-Rex is going to be on display at a dinosaur museum in Zurich, Switzerland for most of this year, 2024. If that name Trinity sounds familiar, Trinity was sold at auction in last April for about $6.1 million US. It's about 50% complete, though the bones came from 3 individuals.
Oh, that's right. That's why it's Trinity.
And it's about 38 feet or 11.6 meters long. Eventually, Trinity will go to Antwerp, Belgium, and the Borentoren, hopefully I pronounced that okay, that's the first skyscraper in Belgium, and it's going to be turned into a museum.
Oh, nice.
And it sounds like the fossils will also be studied.
That's good to know that that's going to be on public display. Because I don't think we knew that when it was sold originally.
Yeah, I don't think we ever hear about those details when we first hear that a fossil has been sold.
It's kind of like that one that got sold and we were all disappointed. And then like 3 years later, we found out it was going to be at a museum in Dubai. We're like, oh, what do you know? It is going to be on display somewhere. Sometimes they just keep it close to the chest and don't tell you where it's going to end up.
Yep.
I remember at the time too saying like, it's kind of interesting that they decided to combine 3 individuals to make a more complete specimen. You don't see that a ton with the carnivorous dinosaurs. I feel like that's something we see with sauropods and like Triceratops, Stegosaurus maybe, but you don't see it as much with Tyrannosaurus.
Maybe with Tyrannosaurus because we have a pretty good idea of what it looks like. That makes it easier to combine.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it'll be on display in Europe. Speaking of dinosaurs in Europe, the Royal Mint has 3 new dinosaur coins. It's the UK's Royal Mint. The dinosaur coins are part of the Tales of the Earth Iconic Specimens collection, and they include Tyrannosaurus, Stegosaurus, and Diplodocus, which is Dippy.
That makes sense. Dippy is always in probably the top 5, if not top 3 or 2 of popular dinosaurs in the UK.
Dippy's great. So these coins are limited edition. They're really pretty. They have them in color, but also in silver and gold. And they were designed by paleo artist Robert Nichols in collaboration with the Natural History Museum.
I think he might have done the last set of the ones with that had Megalosaurus and some of the other Iguanodon and Hylaeosaurus, I want to say. I think they did 3 for the original dinosaurs.
Oh, yeah. Sounds familiar.
I know because we got them.
Well, maybe we'll get this collection.
Maybe.
And most of the coin, it's the dinosaur in the flesh. The Tyrannosaurus is a bit feathery. The Stegosaurus has these green and yellow colors. Dippy's facing forward, kind of looking at you. And then below the dinosaur is their skeleton version in a gold color. And it tells you when they live, Cretaceous or Jurassic. And also features some plants. So it's a really cool coin set.
Yeah, it's amazing the detail they put on coins. Because it's usually, they make them really big
Mhm.
when they're designing them. And you can tell because once they create the coin, if you zoom way in on it, it's like there's all this detail that you never see when you're looking at it with the naked eye.
Yeah.
It's almost a shame they can't make collector's versions that are like the sizes of plates or something. That would be pretty cool.
That would be cool. And we will get to our dinosaur of the day in just a moment, but first, a quick break for our sponsors. And now on to our dinosaur of the day, Bistahieversor, which was a request by Ann5747 via our Patreon and Discord. So thank you. This, I will also mention, was good timing because we mentioned Bistahieversor in last week's episode when we were talking about the new Tyrannosaurus species.
Yes. I think I've always skipped the middle E and just made it Bistahieversor.
This is one of those, when they, in the paper that described it though, they included the pronunciation. Very helpful.
I don't know if I'm going to be able to change.
Maybe if you hear me say it enough times.
Maybe.
Bistahieversor.
There's one.
So, Bistahieversor 2 was a Eutyrannosaurian theropod dinosaur that lived in the Late Cretaceous in what is now New Mexico. It's been found in the Kirtland Formation and Fruitland Formation. It looked like other large tyrannosaurs with, the big head with the deep skull, the sharp teeth, the short arms, and the long tail. The top of the skull of the holotype looks almost like ornamentation that you'd see on a ceratopsid frill. At least that's what it reminded me of.
Really?
Maybe that's just me.
I was thinking maybe more like Allosaurus or something.
That probably makes more sense.
Just a little tuft.
You can see where my biases lie with the herbivores. Anyway, Bistahieversor 3 had a deep snout, which helps show that it wasn't just Tyrannosaurus and other derived tyrannosaurs that had this feature. And that deep skull, again, is really good for bone crushing. Before Bistahieversor, we thought that only later tyrannosaurs like Tyrannosaurus had deeper snouts. One interesting thing, it's possible that there were barriers like the newly forming Rocky Mountains and rising sea levels that kind of isolated Bistahieversor from the northern tyrannosaurs.
Yeah, we were also talking about that last week with T. macraensis, or as some people have been calling it, T-Mex. Because it's in New Mexico, which is way better. It's too bad they didn't name it like T. mexicanum, and then people could just call it T-Mex.
I don't know. It's really cool that it's named after a person.
Yeah.
Really cool for that person.
Yeah.
But that is fun to say T-Rex and T-Mex.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, back to Bistahieversor. I think that's at least 5 times now. Is it helping?
The counting especially helps.
Well, Bistahieversor had some early features of Tyrannosaurus too in the snout and the forehead and with some projections over the eyes. It probably had short arms. That's based on it having a deep skull for the bone crushing because it wouldn't have needed long arms to go after prey, similar to Tyrannosaurus. It had 64 teeth, so it did have a few more teeth than Tyrannosaurus, which had about 60 teeth. It also had an extra opening above its eye and a keel along the lower jaw. And that extra opening above the eye may have been for an air sac to help keep the skull lighter. It also had this complex joint at the quote-unquote forehead to help stabilize the skull. Now, Bistahieversor was similar in size to Daspletosaurus. Adults are estimated to be about 30 feet or 9 meters long and weigh at least 1 ton, although Gregory Paul estimated it to be 26 feet or 8 meters long and weigh 2.75 tons. And in 2016, Molina Perez and Laramendi estimated it to be 29.5 feet or about 9 meters long and weigh 3.6 tons.
Yeah, if it was 30 feet or 9 meters long and weighed only 1 ton, that's definitely a very conservative at least 1 ton. Because you would expect it to be multiple tons at that point.
Yes. There was a juvenile found, and that juvenile is about half the length of the adult. Although in some of the papers it said the juvenile was a subadult. In 2020, there was a study done where they CT scanned and reconstructed the holotype and the juvenile skulls. And the holotype skull was about 3.3 feet long, over a 1 meter. They were able to see the brain cavity, sinus cavities, pathways of some nerves and blood vessels, and more.
Yeah, I love a good CT scan. You can get so much detail out of those babies.
Yes. And they found that Bistahieversor had brain, ear, and sinus systems nearly identical to tyrannosaurids like Tyrannosaurus, Gorgosaurus, and Allosaurus, which is interesting because Bistahieversor isn't a tyrannosaurid.
Oh, really?
Mm-hmm. But it was one of the first tyrannosauroids to get really big. So it's kind of in between basal species and tyrannosaurids. So it really helps fill in gaps of how tyrannosaur brains evolved. It had a lot of air-filled sinuses around the brain and ear, and that helps show that the tyrannosaurid style brain and sinus system were already there before the rise of the Tyrannosauridae.
Or tyrannosaurids.
Or tyrannosaurids. The larger sinuses may have helped keep the skull lighter and helped with hearing at its larger body size, or it could have helped increase surface area to keep cool.
I think your original statement about it making the skull lighter is a good guess on it. Plus, just having less bone that you have to grow is a good evolutionary trick if you can get away with it.
True, especially with such a large skull.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Bistahieversor was probably similar to tyrannosaurids in terms of intelligence and sensory abilities, according to the study. They also found large olfactory bulbs, so it probably had a good sense of smell, and there's evidence of it being agile and keeping its gaze stable while moving its head. It could also hear low-frequency sounds well, and it had binocular vision, so it probably could see fairly well, though it did have small optic lobes. The authors, however, said that that doesn't necessarily mean it had poor vision. Now, the type and only species is Bistahieversor seelii, also known as the Beastie Beast.
Beastie Beast?
Beastie Beast, thank you. When I read it in my head, I think Beastie Boys. Anyway, 4 specimens have been found, including a juvenile. The first fossils of a partial skull and skeleton were described in 1990, but they were thought to be a specimen of Oblisodon, which is a carnivorous dinosaur, only known from a tooth. One of those. So it's a little bit hard to know for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Then more fossils, including a partial skull and juvenile skeleton, were described in 1992. And then in 1998, the Beastie Beast was found, and that includes a complete skull and partial skeleton. In 2000, Thomas Carr and Thomas Williamson suggested that these 4 individuals were Daspletosaurus instead of Oblisodon. And then, 10 years later in 2010, they redescribed the fossils and named them Bistahieversor seelii. The holotype had to be airlifted by a helicopter by the New Mexico Army National Guard. They volunteered it to do it as part of a training exercise.
Oh, that's handy.
Yeah. It took about 2 years to prepare the skull. The holotype and the juvenile had scars on the bones, either from infected injuries or from injuries that were healing when they died. As a quick reminder, the holotype is just a designated specimen for a specific, I'm just going to say dinosaur in this case. And then it's the one that you can compare all other fossils to figure out, like, is this the same dinosaur? Back to the injuries, the juvenile skull is badly damaged. The name, according to the paper that named it, Bistahieversor, comes from, quote, Bistahie, place of the Adobe Formations, Navajo, in reference to the Bistahie Wilderness area. Eversor, destroyer, Greek, in reference to the presumed predatory habits of the animal. Seeley, in reference to Mr. Paul Seeley, research associate at the New Mexico Museum of Natural History, in recognition of his discovery of the holotype specimen, end quote. And Seeley was a volunteer researcher who found the fossils on a weekend trip in 1997.
Nice.
Pretty good weekend.
Yeah. Find a new tyrannosaur genus.
Yeah. Now, other dinosaurs that lived around the same time and place included ankylosaurs, like Zeopelta, the Pachycephalosaur, Stegosaurus, ceratopsids like Navajoceratops and Pentaceratops, hadrosaurs, including Parasaurolophus, dromaeosaurs, and ornithomimids. And other animals that lived around the same time and place included pterosaurs, turtles, alligatoroids, and fish.
And our fun fact of the day goes back to what I promised in the beginning, which is that there is a baby T-Rex that most people don't know about.
What?
The specific fact is that there is a possible juvenile T-Rex specimen that could end the Nanotyrannus debate, but it's in a private collection, so it hasn't been studied.
Oh.
Yeah. Yeah, it hurts a little bit. So the fossil in question is called Baby Bob. It's also sometimes called Son of Samson.
Okay, those are two very different nicknames.
Yeah, it was found back in 2013 in Montana on private land near Jordan, Montana. And the reason it's nicknamed Baby Bob is because the fossil hunter Bob Dietrich is the one who found it. Presumably the Son of Samson nickname is after Samson, which is a full-sized adult T-Rex skeleton, which was sold at auction in 2009. So since this is much smaller and that sold for a lot of money as a marketing trick, I think they were like, we'll call it Son of Samson.
I see. I like Baby Bob.
Me too. And Baby Bob also seems to be the more popular nickname in paleo circles. So I think we're going to go with that. It was actually on display at the Tucson Gem and Mineral Show back in 2016.
If only we'd known.
I know. I really wish we would have gone.
Then we could end the debate. Just kidding. We don't have an eye for that.
Probably not. And there's more issues that I'll get to about why just seeing it doesn't solve the question immediately. So also Bob's brother Alan was leasing the land. So technically he is the owner of Baby Bob. And he was open to the idea of waiting a few years to find a museum to buy the fossil. I found some forum and Facebook posts where Bob was very enthusiastic about finding a museum to house Baby Bob and purchase Baby Bob. They also tried crowdfunding in addition to the directly selling to a museum, but none of it seems to have worked out. It was actually on display at the University of Kansas for about 2 years. I think 2018, 2019 was around when it was on display. And according to Bob, in one of these forum posts, he said that KU was planning to publish a paper describing it in late 2018, but that obviously didn't end up happening. So it's possible that either the journal or the authors decided not to publish it since it's not a publicly available specimen. And I also saw some quotes for once they ran out of patience and listed it on eBay, the University of Kansas was pretty upset and told them to delete any mention of them. And I think if there were any plans to publish a paper on it, they would have ceased those plans at that point.
Interesting.
Yeah. In general, a lot of museums won't even put stuff on display unless it's donated to them or on loan from another museum because they don't want to get caught up in this. We have something private on display and we're promoting private sales of fossils because obviously that goes against what they're trying to do. So the landowner eventually ran out of patience waiting for a museum to buy it, and they put it on eBay in 2019 for $2.95 million. You can look up the auction on the Wayback Machine.
I like the Wayback Machine.
It's very helpful. In the listing, they estimated it at 15 feet long with a 21-inch long skull, which is quite small for a T-Rex, a little bit smaller than the Nanotyrannus holotype. They say, quote, histology shows the specimen to be approximately 4 years old upon death, end quote.
Oh.
But most importantly, their reconstruction of the jaw only has 12 tooth positions, just like an adult T-Rex, and unlike other small T-Rex or Nanotyrannus specimens.
I see.
Obviously, those length and age estimates are not peer-reviewed, so there's a huge grain of salt required. The skull of Baby Bob does look much more like an adult T-Rex than the Nanotyrannus specimens do, but there's also a huge caveat required here, and that's because a lot of the skull was reconstructed, aka sculpted. So considering they wanted to sell it as a quote-unquote baby T-Rex, there's a huge incentive to make it look as much like an adult T-Rex as possible, like a miniature adult T-Rex. And even without the financial incentive, if you're filling in missing gaps, you have to copy something. You have to pick what those gaps are going to come from. And obviously they chose a large T-Rex and not a smaller T-Rex / Nanotyrannus for their sculpt. Although, again, we don't even know how much of it is sculpted versus real material because it hasn't been published. And it's really hard to tell from the few pictures that are available online, just how much of this is original material. So at the end of the day, Baby Bob isn't very useful to the debate about Nanotyrannus versus juvenile T-Rex at the moment. We just don't know how accurately it was reconstructed and whether that 4-year-old age estimate would pass peer review because, like we talked about earlier, histology has a lot of room for interpretation. I thought it was worth mentioning because some of the Team Nanotyrannus paleontologists may have Baby Bob in the back of their mind, even though they don't include it in their papers. So it might be useful just to know that they might be thinking about this as a possibility. For example, I know Pete Larson has seen this specimen quite a bit, and he is a very avid proponent of Nanotyrannus being its own genus.
Interesting. So there's backstory to all this.
Yeah, there's so much backstory. The eBay listing never sold, possibly because it's pretty small for a $3 million display piece. It's certainly very valuable to scientists, but apparently not so much monetarily to collectors. I think that's just because there are a lot of small to medium-sized fragmentary carnivore skulls around, and you can get them a lot cheaper than $3 million. So if you want some big impressive thing for the front of your house, why are you going to pay for this fragmentary 21-inch long skull? Doesn't probably make a lot of sense. At least it doesn't seem to because nobody bought it.
Mm-hmm.
The latest update I can find is a tweet from July 2022 saying, quote, "Next year will be the 10-year anniversary of the discovery of Baby Bob. We gave it 10 years for an institution or museum to step forward to make an offer. Nobody stepped forward, so Baby Bob will be going to auction. Details will be forthcoming soon," end quote. But obviously the 10-year anniversary year of 2023 came and went without an auction. So
maybe it's in the process.
Maybe, but I'm still hoping that maybe in the background there is a museum that turns out to be interested in it, and we can actually get this into the Nanotyrannus / juvenile T-Rex debate. There's also another potential solution here, and that's the Tyrannosaur in the dueling dinosaurs, because that might turn out to be a Nanotyrannus or a unequivocal juvenile T-Rex.
Yeah, we're still a few years, I think, from finding that out, though.
Yes, but it is currently being prepared at the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences, so we know that one's in a public collection and should get us some good data.
What an epic Tyrannosaur episode this turned out to be.
It really did.
Before we end, I just want to thank our listener, Wayne, who emailed us some awesome photos, as he put it, Glyptodon and relatives sighted in the Houston area, including a Glyptodon at the Houston Museum of Natural History.
And a big old armadillo outside.
Yes.
Armadillo sculpture, I should say.
It's relevant because we had a Glyptodon episode in I Know Paleo recently, so thank you, Wayne. And that wraps up this episode of I Know Dino. Thank you for listening. Stay tuned. Next week, we have our interview with Carrie Woodruff, plus 2 new dinosaurs, maybe even 3. We'll see how it goes. You can check out our show notes at iknowdino.com for more information. Thanks again, and until next time.